I'm really excited to hop back into our analysis of Carl's liberalism failures, and we'll see how it goes this time around.
All right. So I'll just start playing, and then we can
no problem.
Go from there.
The average Christian is not angry with me when I say, look, liberalism has this root problem that we really have to address if we want to get rid of the communists. If you want to stop people from being communists, you have to stop making the promise of freedom and equality. Because the communists, you'll notice they say, look, we want everyone to have everything, so everyone is perfectly free and perfectly equal. That is literally the foundational promise of liberalism. So they're not doing anything outside of this tradition at all.
So we already addressed this in our previous session. Basically, he's making the error of conflating liberal freedom and liberal equality to communist goals, essentially.
Yeah, and so I don't know if I want to hop too much back into this because I don't remember what exactly I said last time. All I will say, since we are starting off at this point, is that is fundamentally not true, and no liberal worth their salt would ever tell you that equality is the main goal of liberalism. Equality under the law, equality under society, sure. Equality in terms of their outcomes, in terms of their material conditions, no, not at all. And Carl knows that. I think that's slightly dishonest of him to say that. But we'll let it roll because I'm sure we covered that already.
Alrighty.
And if we want to stop those people from trying to take things away, we have to find a different tradition. Now, the early liberals were well aware that atheism was dangerous to the liberal project. They were well aware that, I mean, John Locke thought that atheism should be illegal, as well as Catholicism. But he was just, yeah, I know, right? He was.
Yeah, so the Catholicism bit is untrue. Anyone who has read Locke's essay concerning toleration, as well as his letter concerning toleration, he actually wrote both. He wrote two. It's interesting. One is lesser known than the other. But anyone who's read any of that knows that he is explicitly saying at multiple points that he has met papists who are perfectly fine and godly people, and he thinks that we should tolerate papists and Catholics and whatnot. Locke's perspective was simply that the Catholic Church as an institution with power, with political power, should not be tolerated. Right? That was Locke's actual argument pertaining to the Catholic Church,
yes.
not that Catholics should be barred from their worship.
Yes, and it's actually a similar argument that we as atheists typically give against the church. The biggest and best way an atheist can fight against the Catholic Church nowadays isn't necessarily on the logical inconsistencies, because the church, as you know, John, has its own. It has the catechisms. It has its own logically defined rules and sets of, like, if this, then this is why this. And so it's easy to follow along. So what you have to do is you have to tear down the glory of the magisterium of the church, the entire body of the church. The institution itself has to be eroded. This only ties into Lockean liberalism because Locke's fundamental issue was with the institutional control the church could and did have at the time. And that is his complaint. His complaint is not with the theological claims of the Catholic Church. Never, and he never would have made such an argument.
Yeah, and I would go further and point out that while Locke did think that atheism should not be tolerated, that was because Locke held this erroneous belief that atheists would never be able to partake in civil society because they cannot be held to oaths. Right. Ultimately, yes. Locke felt that, and our founding fathers felt that ultimately a free society has to rest on oaths of loyalty that people take to that society. I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Right. There's this idea that when you swear this oath, you are putting your word on the line and saying, this is something I will stand to. And Locke felt that atheists cannot be held to oaths because of this idea that an oath requires that you swear by God, right? It requires allegiance to God in order for an oath to have any moral effect at all. And I think that is completely erroneous, obviously. I'm an atheist, and I very much believe in the sanctity of oaths, because I have this old-fashioned belief that a man should be held to his word.
Yes.
And honestly, I do wish that people overall had more of that sort of perspective. It seems to me that a lot of people in government do not really care one bit about their oaths and about the oaths that they take to preserve the liberties of their people. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this argument that Locke had, that atheists cannot be held to oaths, honestly is baseless. And as such, I argue that all of Locke's arguments in his letter concerning toleration, regarding tolerating Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, all of those arguments can also apply to atheists as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I one thing I want to just point out that I've always found interesting, and if you want to comment on this, you're more than free and welcome to do so. But Locke's criticism by stating that atheists cannot be held to oaths, and specifically godly oaths, in this analysis, in this reading, it's very important to Locke that you are under something, that there is something you can be held to account for. That kind of flies in the face of his individualistic philosophy in a lot of ways, and I've always found that rather an interesting contradiction that you see between this sort of man is a blank slate, man is sort of neutral, if not somewhat good, but also atheists can't be held to oaths, therefore bad, which is kind of interesting from my point of view, because if I'm to look at men as a blank slate, and also to accept that men are capable of inherent good, but also evil at the same time, then one of those concepts has to also be that men can be held to their word, and that their word in and of itself should suffice for an oath. I don't know if you have a thought on that, but that's something I
actually think it ties back to Locke's proposed solution, because the big problem, the dragon that Locke was attempting to slay, was this idea that people are born slaves to the king, right? Mm-hmm. Due to the divine right of kings, it's as soon as you're born, you're nothing but property, you're chattel. You can be disposed of as you want, according to the ideology of people like Sir Robert Filmer. And Locke was trying to destroy that, but his solution was to situate sovereignty not in the state, but in the individual. But to justify that situation, he used really what he really did was he situated sovereignty, the sovereignty that is situated in God, that Christians unilaterally assume. He used that to argue that political sovereignty is situated in the individual, because, well, God gave us, our rights. He gave his grant to Adam was one that was to the earth, was one that was universal, that applies to all mankind. And so as a result, what he's doing is he's trying to use God's sovereignty as an argument for man's sovereignty. The problem is that doesn't actually work, because I think you run into the same problem as you would with the divine right of kings, where your rights are nothing but privileges, mere privileges given to you by some authority. Now all Locke has done, though, is he's removed that authority from being an earthly authority and pushed it outside the bounds of reality to an authority that, obviously both of us would argue doesn't exist. I don't think that is a viable solution. I think the proper solution is simply to situate sovereignty in the individual, to recognize that human beings are fundamentally entitled to a certain degree of dignity, that they are not to have their lives violated. In fact, I'd argue that it is a fundamental contradiction. Whenever someone maintains a contradiction, whenever they act as if they can violate the sovereignty of another, because as if their sovereignty is not to be violated, right? I honestly think all hypocrisy, all moral inconsistency is nothing but logical inconsistency when applied to ethical topics.
Yes. No, that's a fair point. I agree with that.
So you want to continue?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Definitely. I want to see what he leads up to, because I'm much more familiar with this half of the video from previous projects. So I can't wait to get into this part.
All right.
he was attacked by idealists like Berkeley for saying, look, if you create a mechanical universe, then God will die in the minds of men because he's not necessary for the world, for the universe to continue functioning. And Locke just like, no, that's not going to happen. Well, that has happened. That's exactly what's happened. I'm one of those products. I'm an atheist. You know, I didn't choose to be. I was just raised in an atheist society, and this is just how I came out. And so it is absolutely the case that this has happened. So Christians, when I say, well, look, liberalism is wrong at the foundations, they don't get upset because they have a moral foundation of their own that is separate to liberalism. However, with the materialist liberal atheist and all of the dogmatic atheists, liberals, you'll notice are atheists. You know, you'll notice that every single one of these hardcore liberal activists in any stripe, you know, whether it's the most radical communist progressive or the James Lindsay types, they're all atheists. Mm-hmm. Right? And the problem that they have with me attacking the root of liberalism is they don't have an alternative.
No. The problem we have is that you're just fundamentally wrong. I like that is the problem. It's not that you're like attacking some darling. It's that you're just incorrect about the point. And also, what is this like, Carl? Okay, I can't address this to him because he might not see this. And if you do see this, Carl, I've paid you multiple lyrical compliments on X and on Instagram, and we've exchanged DMs at one point. So you are a huge fan of yours, and you are a hero of mine, and I will say that before I say this. Yeah, I know for a fact that you have genuinely looked at Christian arguments before and religious arguments and had to say no. So yes, by default, you did choose to be this way, and you did choose to think this way. Every time a human being is born into a family or a situation, there are certain circumstances that are thrust upon them that they do not choose. However, the way that you think is fundamentally also guided by your individual nature, which you have control over. Some people choose to look deeper into certain topics than others, and therefore their mind changes. I know you're one of those kind of people. I've watched you long enough to know that. You've made the fundamental decision that when you argue against a Christian point, or you argue against a Muslim point or a Jewish point, whatever it may be, no, you are firmly placing yourself into the box of nope, I'm choosing to be this way. And it's fine to say to admit that. I don't think atheism, honestly, and I don't know if you would agree with me, Ruin, on this one, but I don't think atheism is one of those things that you can just say, oh, I just kind of was it. And then actually genuinely mean it. You can certainly say like, oh, I'm not religious, but that's not the same thing as saying I'm an atheist. I think you can not be religious and not necessarily be an atheist.
There's a difference between being, I guess, a passive atheist or just a general non-believer and actually considering the arguments and then coming to a conclusion, right? His argument, oh, well, I was raised in an atheist society. I mean, one, I'm not sure, did the UK qualify as an atheist society when he was a child? I don't know if that's true. But if we were to go further as well, he's arguing. I mean, yeah, he does have a point in which when it comes to I think that ethics and politics are necessarily intertwined. I don't think anyone's politics is truly separate from their ethics.
True.
And he's essentially arguing that Christians have a separate ethical foundation in their religion outside of the liberal tradition, whereas atheists have nothing but whatever political tradition they attach themselves to, which I would argue is a very ham-handed way of saying something that's true, which is that the problem is that it's the same with Christians as well, right? Christians who truly believe in their ethics, they advocate for theocratic types of government. And the reason why they do so is because that is what the politics of their book demands, right? It demands that the God's law be established on earth. So honestly, he's not really making much of a point at all. And with regards to the separate moral foundation that Christians allegedly have, I would argue that, well, they have no moral foundation at all. I mean, just saying, well, God exists and has commands, therefore we obey, acting as if that's somehow an actual moral philosophy is ridiculous. It isn't. Whenever a Christian claims, "Oh, you can't make moral claims because you're an atheist because you don't have any moral authority to appeal to," they're assuming that as a default premise that moral claims require moral authority. They're assuming that moral principles must necessarily be dictated by someone, naturally someone who's very powerful. Every single Christian argument that has ever existed, and this is a bold claim I'm going to make right here, every Christian or otherwise religious argument that's ever been made about the supposed foundation of morality ultimately boils down to might makes right. It's, oh, well, because my God is all powerful and because he can create things, therefore he has the right to make decisions. I'm actually making a video response to some comments on a video I made. And many of the comments, when it comes down to questions such as, genocides in the Old Testament, the slaughter of entire people, wholesale, men, women, and children, the argument essentially just boils down to, well, God created life, therefore he can destroy it. As if that was somehow an argument.
Which it's not. And I also want to point this out too. Every time a Christian in particular says that, they're proving to the audience and to anybody that hears them, that's not directly watching them, but let's say is in the same room as them when they say this, it doesn't take somebody with a 300 IQ to realize that means their morality is incredibly subjective and they themselves are relativistic. By the necessity of a godlike figure for them means that by that very definition, their morals and their ethics are relativistic in nature, because whatever God says must be right. If God can be wrong, then God is not worth following. And no Christian I've ever met has ever said, unless they were kind of already on the way out, I'll say this, has ever said, no. Well, if God told me to kill somebody, I wouldn't do it. The typical argument is, well, no, God wouldn't do that, even though you can look in the Old Testament and see that God has done that multiple times. But yeah, no, and I think it's a fun little hole to poke. But typically it doesn't land on them. Typically it just lands for everybody else. I think that's important to note, though, because Carl will make some moral claims for Christianity later on in the video that we can kind of circle back to. So,
all right.
So what I'm telling them is essentially, you are not a moral person. I'm going to tear this up and look at these disgusting rotten roots. We're going to throw this away, and they will be set adrift with literally no moral compass. That's why they're so upset by me.
What, like the rotten roots of Christianity?
I was going to say the same exactly.
Supposed moral compass that Christianity possesses. This idea that somehow, I mean, it's ridiculous to me that Sargon is essentially acting. He's basically adopting Christian premises, even though as an atheist, he's adopting Christian premises, presuppositions that just are going unacknowledged about the supposed moral nature of Christianity. And yet the open question still remains, is in fact obedience to the demiurge, as the Gnostics would call him, is this actually moral? Is it actually moral to obey God, even if God did exist? I've never once heard a single argument validating God's moral authority. Not once. I don't think that there is one, because ultimately to do so would be to invalidate the very concept of morality itself.
Well, it also doesn't. Okay, so the way that maybe somebody in the comments of this video, maybe even you, John, would say that this is wrong of me to say, but a moral truth, or an absolute, if you really want to take it that far, should be applicable to all hypotheticals and all living or fictional things. So, for example, if we say on Earth that dictatorship is wrong, and it is wrong to force others to subjugate themselves to you on pain of death or torture or suffering or some sort of positive or negative punishment, and we would say that that's wrong for a man to do, For you to be morally consistent, it also must be the case that it is wrong for a deity to do so. And if it isn't the case, then your internal ethics and morals are not consistent, and they can't be. And the answer a Christian cannot give, but they typically do, is that, well, he created everything. Well, if that line of logic is to be followed, then is every moral and logical decision your parents make to also be followed because they created you and they've given you the very life you have? Well, no, nobody would say that. And why is that? Because on its face, it's absurd.
Well, ultimately, the entire Christian moral paradigm rests on a fundamental hypocrisy that God is not subject to what are supposedly his own standards, right? Especially when you talk to like a Christian who gives lip service to secular political ideas like the freedom of speech or the freedom of religion. And it's like, oh yeah, those are great things. We need those things. But then as soon as you apply those to God's cosmic regime, you're like, yeah, but I mean, God doesn't respect the freedom of speech on earth or in heaven. He commended people on earth, such as the zealot in Leviticus, who stabbed to death a man and his wife simply because she was a foreigner and they worshipped a different god. He commended him for his zeal, like, oh, that's such a great and zealous action, and obviously. The whole problem of hell completely debunks the notion that God ever valued Enlightenment values such as the freedom of conscience to begin with. So if God can send you to eternal gulag simply for disagreeing with him, then he clearly doesn't care about the freedom of conscience and is a tyrant. That much is quite obvious to anyone who has the courage to think consistently. Honestly, I think that failing to think consistently is a form of cowardice.
Yes, because typically I would say it's not always out of a sense of not understanding logical inconsistencies. It's typically because they know that if they have to follow their own logic, it's going to break down, and it's more comfortable to stay where they are than it is to accept that. And I'll back you up on this one. I've never, ever heard an argument a Christian is given for the moral superiority of God that when you pose a question like, what if God tells you to murder somebody, or any sort of contradictions in one of the three oughts that God is, for example, like that he is, one of the three concepts that God is, that he is omnipresent, he is omnipotent, and he is omnipowerful. That if you were to say something like, can God create a rock that he himself cannot lift? That is an insolvable problem. That is if you want to see like a really funny brain reaction, ask that question to any Christian, no matter how faithful they are.
Yeah, every Christian I've ever asked that question to just responds with, that's a dumb question. How dare you ask that question, right? Basically attacking the question rather than answering it properly. They're like, oh, well, or they'll try some illogic, like, well, both. It's like, well, this is literally A and non-A. You can't have both A and non-A. You're just rejecting logic at this point. And
yes,
if they persist in that, well, at that point, you know that talking to them is futile because, I mean, to quote Thomas Paine, attempting to reason with a man who has rejected its use is like attempting to administer medicine to the dead.
Yes. And well, one of the things, too, that I hope we can get this maybe towards the end of the video when Carl gets more super pro Christianity, because he's about to segue into it, but we're not all the way there yet. We're not to the super pro Christian rhetoric yet. I view it as a fundamental cop-out to say that God, like whenever a question like that exists, a lot of people that I have debated with or had this discussion with have said, well, God exists outside of time. It's the same reason why he can see all things that ever have happened or ever will happen. It's the same reason why we still have free will, and he doesn't actually, he knows what you're going to do before you do it. It's not because he set the path up for you. It's because he can see all, because he exists outside of time. For me, that, I don't know about you, but that just reads like a total cop-out. at that point, you're supposing hypotheticals. We might as well just start bringing up random bullshit at that point. It's like, okay, that's a total brain killer. I don't like. There's no way to get around that at that point. Which,
yeah, honestly,
I mean,
a lot of these kind of conversations really just boil down to playground antics. It's like, oh, I have a magic missile. Oh, I have an impenetrable shield. Well, I have the unstoppable magic missile that will forever penetrate every impenetrable shield. But my impenetrable shield stops forever penetrating magic missiles. It's like, it's the same. It's just fucking kids, basically. It's an extension of these schoolyard antics. Only they become that the stakes are much higher when it's adults, because adults literally kill each other over this shit.
I think that'll tie back in nicely, though, once we get to Carl's going to start talking here soon about the idea that there are certain things in life that we get emotional feelings from as human beings that we cannot properly explain. That's going to be a time where I'll bring in some more metaphysical destruction for the Christians, but not yet.
All right, let us proceed.
Me doing this. So I have to say, well, okay, was Christianity that bad, actually?
Well, then, from an atheist perspective, that's what I find really interesting over the years when I've been watching I don't know if it's fair to say a political evolution, but I think
it's definitely done an evolution. You
very accurately point out that a lot of the classical liberals, the secular atheists, when push comes to shove, either they don't have an objective moral framework to stand on, or the moral framework that they are operating upon is actually just based off of Christianity, which they simultaneously, oftentimes deride. So personally, as an atheist who is also skeptical about classical liberalism, where should our morality and things like the concept of natural rights derive from? Like, how do you reconcile that? What do you personally use as your moral framework?
I use tradition.
Or are
All right. So what were you going to say about that?
I used the term objective earlier, which is going to make me sound contradictory. I don't believe that there is such a thing as objective morality. I think there is objective. There are objective things that are inherent to the way humans in general. Well, I guess that doesn't make sense either. But when we talk about morals and moral foundations, it is incredibly difficult to say that something is so true or so correct that it can never be breached. The reason why I would say that is that if you run the simple thought experiment of like, I'm an American liberal. I'm an American liberal, socialist, but whatever, that's close enough. I love freedom of speech. I love my country. I have the Betsy Ross flag tattooed on my shoulder right here. It's very near and dear to my heart, okay? I have that national pride and those values in me. If I was born in Canada, I would not feel that way about the United States. And even more so, if I was born in Africa, I would not feel that way about the United States. The same thing is true for the morality you espouse as you grow up. There are certain concepts, for instance, the fact that you don't want to kill people in your own in-group, right? That every human society kind of accepts. However, there are plenty of other things, such as stealing, such as cheating, such as even outright conflict, that are different based on where you are born, and your moral perceptions about those change. Now, I'm not going to say that makes them good, because I'm not a relativist. I won't say that makes them good. But what I will say is that you cannot declaratively state that this is the only moral objective and know that for a fact. I can feel that way, but I cannot know that. I don't know where you'd fall on that spectrum.
So I believe in moral objectivity. I'm a moral realist. I think that morality is real, independent of human perception. And I would argue, in response to what you just said, pertaining to, well, yes, there's clearly a bunch of different moral perspectives. People throughout the world are very much influenced by their culture and have very different takes on things like cannibalism, things like slavery, things like all sorts of different issues. It's clearly there's many different moral perspectives. Clearly, the ancient Israelites didn't care about slavery, even sexual slavery. According to the Old Testament, it's okay to sell your daughter into sexual slavery. The point that I would make, though, is, yes, I acknowledge that there are plenty of different moral perceptions, but that is irrelevant. See, the claim that the moral objectivist is making is not that everyone agrees about morality. The claim that the moral objectivist is making is that there are certain things, certain conditions, and that are a moral good, regardless of your perceptions about those things. To harken back to something you said that you do believe that there are certain things, certain conditions that are in fact positive for the human species and negative. Clearly, dying of starvation is bad. Clearly, living your life in slavery is bad. Clearly, being miserable and unhappy is bad. So then what is good? I mean, if we can quite clearly point that certain things are quite detrimental for human beings, then we can definitely point to the opposite as being the good. I would contend that there is one thing that is fundamentally, objectively a good, and that is happiness. I would argue that all human pursuits ultimately are a pursuit towards happiness. Now, here's the thing, is that humans can very much be delusional about what will make them happy. They oftentimes will pursue courses of action that in fact will make them unhappy. Even so, though, this formulation does not require that all actions have to be correctly aimed. Rather, this formulation is simply that all human endeavors are attempts at a happier existence. And that includes even the moral conceptions that people have that are anti-happiness. Ultimately, I contend that the fundamental reason why a Christian chooses to worship their God, regardless of their opinions about it, the fundamental reason why they do so is either out of fear or out of desire for the eternal reward. I would contend is the fundamental reason. It is fear of eternal anguish and desire for eternal bliss and being with their family and all those other nice things. And because of this, I think I ultimately think that is the point of life. That is the point of all human life, is the attainment of the maximization of one's experience, right? And ultimately, you might ask the question, then why not just be high on heroin all the time? I mean, clearly that is a more miserable experience than actually engaging in meaningful and productive activity. And the whole reason why humans are different from other animals is because we learned evolutionarily, how to delay gratification. There is a old technique apparently in Southeast Asia for catching monkeys, where they'll put fruit inside of a hollowed out coconut shell. And when the monkey reaches in to grab that fruit and nuts in his fist, now his fist is too big to fit outside the hole. The hunters show up and the monkey can't escape because the monkey will not let go of his prize, right? The human response is to let go, and that is what separates us. We can delay gratification, we can apply our reasoning to better understand the steps necessary to achieve a happy existence.
Yes. No, I would agree with that. Now, I want to flesh out my position a little bit more, because I was, but also wasn't expecting you to have that position, because I wasn't too sure where you fell on the objectivist scale. So when I say that there are subjective moral standards, I want people to note, and I want you to note as well, I'm not a relativist, so I'm not saying that therefore it's okay, let people live as they live. That's not at all my point. Somebody can perfectly be, reasonably believe that whatever they're practicing is moral, but if it ever endangers my society, I have every right, and if I have any ability to, I will also attempt to stop that from encroaching on my experience. If that works for you in your own society, go ahead and do your own rituals, do your own thing. I don't care if you're not affecting me. However, if you are affecting me, if you are affecting my people, I care about that very, very much so. I'm not saying that outside of their own vacuums, these things can ever be positives. What I will say is that when I'm talking about particular things being objective, if I can use a term like that while being somewhat of a subjectivist myself, for being objective positives for the species, I'm talking about community. Community is an objective positive for the species. I would say things like individual autonomy are objective positives for the species. Sense of self is an objective positive for the species. I wouldn't say happiness is. I think satisfaction is. I don't think happiness is.
See, that's the point I'm getting at, though, is when I'm talking about happiness, I'm talking about what you would call satisfaction or fulfillment, right? I'm referring to Aristotle's conception known as eudaimonia. I'm not just talking about pleasure. Right. I'm not just talking about like just base animal pleasure. I'm talking about a sense of spiritual fulfillment that you achieve through meaningful labor. And I contend, as Aristotle did, that the only means by which to do so is by developing personal virtues that enable you to better live through life. That's basically the whole foundation of eudaimonist ethics. And, this particular brand of virtue ethics is that happiness is the point of life. And your personal traits that you develop, your good habits, are the habits that enable you to better achieve that. It's the happiness I'm talking about isn't just I drink alcohol and I'm drunk, I'm happy. It's like that's not happiness in this context. That's pleasure, and pleasure can quite quickly lend itself towards extreme unhappiness. Some of the most unhappy people are constantly surrounded by luxuries and pleasures because they're attempting to feed a hole inside them. Christians would call that a God-shaped hole. I would call that a meaning-shaped hole.
All right, let's proceed.
Are you going? Oh, so you're going to do the Jordan Peterson route?
Yeah, it seems to be something that is true. It is absolutely true that we've inherited a moral tradition from our ancient past, and it absolutely has a proven track record of results. A lot of Christians are going to say, yeah, but it does lean very heavily on Christianity, doesn't it? And I'll say, yes, sure. I'm not opposed to Christian morality. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it, frankly.
For about 17 or 1800 years, Christianity ruled the West, and men lived in chains. It was not until the secular ethical premises of the liberal tradition arrived that men started to shake off those chains. I would contend that this moral tradition, that Sargon is backing the wrong horse, I mean, the wrong moral tradition here.
Yes. The only reason he's saying Christianity is because Christianity became intertwined with liberalism later on, and the two can get along quite well because liberalism can exist with almost anything else. That is why he likes it. It's not because of the Christian morals and ethics themselves.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when you really take a good look at it, when you look under the hood, you find that there is no way to make the fundamental premises of liberty comport with the ideas of Christianity. These do not work together. It is impossible to simultaneously desire freedom and slavery.
Yes. And you're completely correct about that. I forget what he says next, but I think there's a zinger coming, if I'm not mistaken. So
I don't really see what the objection to it is, actually. The objection from the liberal atheist seems to be, I don't believe in God. It's like, okay, but you're not saying you don't like the morality then. What you're saying is you need it to be rationally justified.
Yes, I do. I do need that. I actually, believe it or not, this didn't hit the first time I watched it all the way through. Because I guess that line in and of itself, in particular, yes, if I'm going to follow something, whether it's the morals or any code of it whatsoever, I need it to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, I'm not going to follow it. Okay, that is the whole point.
Go further, I would say I am against Christian morality. I hate Christian morality. I don't consider Christian morality to be moral, either in its foundation in just the blind adherence to the commands of the supposedly divine, or the way it plays out. I think Nietzsche was completely on point when he called Christian morality a slave morality, because that really is all that it is. Christ is in the Sermon on the Mount. He's beseeching people, saying, "Blessed are they who are meek, right? Blessed are they who basically roll over and are fucking doormats. If a man asks you to do something for him, do that thing 2 times. It's a...
So we call this podcast Heirs of Fire. We haven't announced that yet. This is why, right? This is almost like our little version of Lad's Hour, okay? It's a way more dressed down, way more fun, way more fiery and passionate, and we're just kind of shooting the shit, but also talking about subjects, okay? Now, one of the things I want to bring up, and I need an answer to this, I really do. What is moral about telling somebody to think not for the morrow and to not hate on thrift, to tell them that it's principally almost immoral to be rich because Jesus says that fundamentally it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven, which, by the way, that isn't to say it's really hard. It's impossible. That is the entire point. I believe I'm quoting that correctly. I think I am. I'm 99.9%.
You are quoting that correctly. And I mean, the fact of the matter is that Christian ethics are, I would call them, interestingly enough, I'd call them I'd say that in a lot of ways, most, if not all, schools of socialism are fellow travelers with Christianity in this regard.
Wow,
they share the same ethical premises. Like, rich people bad, and also the importance of community and the prioritization of community over the individual. That's a very Christian concept, and it's a very socialist concept. Actually, one thing you said earlier that I was interested at, that I didn't challenge and push back on, but I was thinking of doing so, was when you talked about community being an objective good. I don't think community is an objective good. I think quite often community can devolve into tyranny. That you can very much become a slave to your community, and that oftentimes community, particularly if you're a minority of some sort, I'm not even just talking about ethnic minority. If you're like an intellectual minority, you can very well find yourself at a state where your community enters into a state of war against you. That is, but then again, you could argue that is not true.
Okay. Well, no, I wouldn't say that because I'm not like a blue-haired 21-year-old on my campus or something. I wouldn't try to say that. It would be wrong of me to say. What I would say is that communities can make mistakes, and communities are not perfect because communities are not inherently made up of perfect moral individuals, because none of us are perfect moral individuals. I would say that community is necessarily a good because humanity as an entirety is a cooperative enterprise of individuals. It does not mean the value of the individual should go down, although it often does, which I would disagree with. I disagree with that assertion from a lot of the collectivists that I know, which I guess by default I am also one. But a collective needs to understand its individuals. A collective needs to respect the right of the individual while being a collective, because collectives can only work as cooperative enterprises of people who inherently might view themselves as part of a group, but also view themselves as valued members of said group. That would be my rebuttal.
I would contend that the only community that I value, and the only sort of community that I'm willing to share with people, is community that exists for the purpose of the mutual edification of its members, that exists such that it protects and preserves the rights and dignities of its members. That is the only sort of community I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the kind of community that is interested in compelling some to sacrifice for the sake of others. All right, let us proceed.
You're prepared to be utilitarian and say, well, it just works. So why can't you be utilitarian in this case and just say, well, it just works? I don't need to personally believe in God to see the effect of Christianity and the good it seems to do for actual Christians as well. Like if I met Christians who are bad people or mean-spirited or just doing immoral things, I'd be like, okay, well, I don't want them to be like that. But I don't ever meet Christians like that. I'm sure someone will say, well, what about the Westboro Baptist Church? It's like, okay, but I'm looking around, bro, and I just don't see any Westboro Baptist Church. You know what I mean? Like, that seems to be like 5 really dysgenic,
how British of you? How very
people.
British of you to say that? How very particularly British etiquette of you to say that? Because I can assure you, if you had been in the United States, there are plenty of Christians who are nice. But there are even more Christians that I know who are passive-aggressive assholes about being nice. Who you'll say, oh, well, they'll ask you, so do you have a relationship with God? And you'll say no. And they'll say, okay, I'll pray for you. And it'll be like, as if you're doing something wrong off rip. That'd be like, it'd be like retorting. I mean, it's a funny meme, right? I'm stealing this quote, but that'd be like retorting, it's okay, I'll think for you every time somebody said that. Like, you wouldn't do that whether you thought it or not, because it just kind of makes you an asshole. Like,
in what world is it nice or kind to essentially threaten people with hellfire for not believing in your beliefs? I mean, and the Christian might say, well, I'm not threatening you, God is. But it's like, well, actually, even if that were true, you're going along with it. You're acting as if that's okay and moral. You're operating based on the premise, a fundamental premise that violates my human dignity in any interaction that we could have. So how on earth could I interpret your actions as nice? It's ultimately, I mean, if you really want a good look at like the supposedly loving and kind nature of Christianity, just speak against it on a public forum, right? You find, I mean, my last video garnered so many people just showing up talking about how, oh yes, you're gonna burn in hell, and some people saying, oh yeah, I can't wait till you're burning in hell, or it's like it can't happen soon enough was one. It's like, a lot of these people, they just clearly don't have any morals at all. All the while, they're turning around and telling the atheist who is questioning their belief system that they can't have morals. It's this amazingly perverse like inversion.
I was sorry to cut you off. Like 2 days ago, or I guess it was last night actually. I was in a Groyper Twitter space trying to just hear them out, give them the benefit of the doubt for once, because I've heard them out before. But there was one nice guy that I knew who was there, and I wanted to say hi to him. So I went in, and of course I knew as I stepped into this space, I was about to get some of the flamingly high IQ takes from a lot of these Christian nationalists. So I didn't fight back because I was in a space with about 60 of them. So I was just trying to be like cordially competitive, but I wasn't, trying to get griped. So didn't go hard in the paint. But one of the guys, after I was explaining this gut-wrenching experience that I went on, where I lost my Catholic faith, which to me, I've talked about this with Peter Clark, and you guys will see a video of me and Peter up soon on our editorial board podcast about this, where we compare the loss of one's faith in its entirety to the loss of a friend or a family member, if you really truly believed it and loved it because it meant something to you. No, it doesn't mean that I regret it or that I now want it back, not at all, or that I'm sad that I did lose it. No. Imagine somebody telling their true and honest deconversion, or I guess deconversion is the right term, or conversion to atheism, I suppose, whatever. Then telling them maybe you should just not be a bitch and go back to church, as a genuine response, as a genuine argument, and then wonder why people shun you, laugh at you, and never listen to you. This is the kind of behavior that you hear. Well, like you'll make a perfectly valid point, and you'll say, "Well, I just can't believe it. I went to mass, I did the liturgy of the hours, I went to confession, I talked to my priests. None of it made sense." And their response is, "Well, maybe you just need to open your heart more." As if that's a positive response that's not just snarky and inherently self-fellatiating.
Let's continue.
Yes.
People who are using Christianity as a cover. There seem to be lots of good people who are good Christian people, and they seem to be getting on just fine. So I'm really not terribly averse to this. But the point you're making, the question you're raising, is exactly legitimate. Well, if liberalism can't be the moral axis around which the modern atheist revolves, where does he go? And that's scary for a lot of people. That puts them in a position where they genuinely don't know how to feel about themselves. Because the thing is, it's entirely possible that a lot of the things we're doing are actually really, really immoral. And I'm not going to mention any particular movements that are concerned about gender and are doing terrible things to kids or anything. But it might well be that we're in a position where we're doing really immoral things. So.
Right. And I think that's probably more likely than a lot of center leftist classical liberals would like to admit. And it's interesting because the way you talk about Christianity, it reminds me of two people, Ayaan Hirsi Ali and also Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you follow Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's someone who
not closely.
She previously underwent female genital mutilation as a child. I forget which country specifically, but somewhere on the African continent. And she eventually ended up. Yeah, I think that sounds right. She eventually ended up moving to Europe and was for a long time at the forefront of the, I guess, humanist, secularist online movement. That's how I became familiar with her work. She does a lot of great things and is obviously a very vocal critic of Islam. Not that long ago, she actually came forward in support of Christianity. And I believe now even calls herself a Christian. And a lot of these atheist types that I was following, they watched her video and their critique was like, well, okay, it seems like you're not actually professing a testimony that we would see in a lot of Christian churches where you express how you've been saved, how you've come to have faith. This almost seems more utilitarian, as in these are the reasons why I believe Christian values and traditions are superior. That's not necessarily being a Christian, though. And I think Jordan Peterson, he does something similar. You have that infamous debate with Sam Harris where you go around for, I don't even know how many hours talking about what actually is truth. Jordan Peterson, he always says, and I've asked him about this pointedly in interviews, like, do you believe in God? Well, I behave as if I do, and that's really the same. But is it, though?
No.
Is it that? That's not the same.
I think that Lauren Chen is making a good point here. Probably one of the only ones she does in this entire podcast. What she's touching on is the simple fact that claiming that a belief system is useful is not the same thing as claiming that it is true. Mm-hmm. True, in order for something to be true, it has to be useful. But usefulness is a necessary, not a sufficient litmus test for truth. Mm-hmm. It's usefulness. There are plenty of lies that are also useful. And so claiming that something is useful certainly is not the same thing as claiming that it is true.
Yes. And before I go into this, I want to speak to the audience really briefly here. So over the course of part 2 of this video, I believe both John and myself have gotten a little bit more aggressive with Christians in general. If you're a Christian and you're watching this, I want to let you know one thing. I fundamentally do believe that Christianity, for like your old grandma and grandpa types of people, can do good things. And for some people is the reason why they think they act a certain way, and can be a reason why they might do something good. It might give them a reason to do so. I can concede that for certain people. And if you are a Christian, I'm not saying you're a bad person for being a Christian. I know plenty of you. I'm surrounded by you, and plenty of you are, as Carl did say, plenty of you are good and decent people. I would say that the reason why you are good and decent is because you simply are good and decent, not because a book says so. If you want to tell yourself that, that's fine. I
would argue that the extent to which a Christian is virtuous is quite often correlates with the extent to which they depart from their Christianity. It's not to say that departing from Christianity is necessarily in the right direction morally, but I think that most of our greatest virtues are not to be found in Christianity. And if anything, they are found in behaviors that we have that do not necessarily align with the Christian submissive altruist ethics.
Or to be found, and I'll make this point, or to be found in simple logical processes like the one that I espoused earlier, where I said when I was younger, I said, well, if God is God, if God knows everything, if God understands everything, he must be nuanced. He must understand there are secondary and tertiary reasons for certain things, and therefore he must weigh them differently based on the subjective experience of those involved and the facts of the matter, right? Even that, to a Protestant in particular, is not allowed, because I am now providing God with there's a secondary logical reason found outside of the text of the Bible, or a secondary process found outside of the Bible, by which I'm giving God some moral grace. That in and of itself is something that a lot of people, Protestants included, do. And that is what makes people good, the ability to look at something and say, maybe in this case it applies, maybe in this case it doesn't apply. But that is not because of the Christianity. That is because of their own logic. That is because they're able to look at things and problem solve. You'll notice I excluded Catholics because at least the Catholics have the catechism, which can and does say, well, in this case it might be all right, in this case it might not be. This is important, this is very unimportant. For example, the church saying that like believing in evolution is perfectly fine because God created the evolutionary process, or that sex acts of all kinds can be incorporated into sex between a married couple because of course it is, they're a married couple, who cares, or that suicides may not be immoral in and of themselves because that person was not of right mind, and to commit a sin you must know it is a sin and also accept it in right and true mind of yourself. Those sort of reasonings are not found within most of like the Christian tradition in America, I would say, overall, because America's not a Catholic country. So that's kind of where I just want to leave that for any of the Christian audience. I don't hate you. I don't think poorly of you. I'm going off lived experience, and and some of those things I do hold as principles, though.
Yeah, to the Christians out there, I bear you no ill will. It is as you say, hate the sin, love the sinner. That is the perspective I take on Christianity, much the same way that conservative Christians, the perspective they have on homosexuality. So ultimately, a lot of Christians might claim not to hate gay people; they just hate the sin of homosexuality. I don't hate Christians. I just hate the sin of Christianity.